Welcome, and we'll be starting shortly. Good evening. I'm Dana Blum, Senior Director for Common Sense in the Bay Area. Welcome. For those of you who may not know us, Common Sense is a nonprofit organization dedicated to improving the lives of all kids and families by providing the trustworthy information, education, and the independent voice we all need to thrive in the 21st century. Tonight, we are hosting a discussion on how we can use the power of media to talk about difficult topics. We are honored to be partnering with the team from the documentary film Belly of the Beast to host a discussion about the film's themes of systemic racism and reproductive rights. Two topics parents and educators may find difficult to discuss with their kids. We know that media not only influences our own identity and how we see the world, but importantly, media influences how our kids see themselves and how they relate to the world. We're excited to help give you some tools and language to begin these important discussions with your family. Remember, media makes a big impression on kids, but the messages you send from the media you choose to the conversations you initiate are what kids will hold in their hearts and minds long after the final credits. I am thrilled to introduce the award-winning filmmaker, director, and producer of Belly of the Beast, Erica Cohn, and my colleague and friend, Diane Jones-Lowrey, our Senior Director of National Partnerships and Community Engagement at Common Sense. We will have time for Q&A at the end of the conversation, so please put your questions or comments in the chat, and our Common Sense team will be moderating and providing links to all the resources. First, before we begin, let's watch the trailer of Belly of the Beast and then begin our discussion. Thanks.
There is a culture of secrecy in California.
I have some fear. What kind of repercussions will I get for coming on and talking about this?
I've always been a fighter, but it wasn't truly birthed until I was in prison.
They did a pelvic exam.
He said I had a fibroid.
I was told that I had cancer cells.
When I came out, I felt like something was wrong.
We were getting hundreds of letters about medical abuses every month.
When was the first time a doctor told you that you may be missing your ovaries?
No one ever told me that.
I had been intentionally sterilized, and I had been lied to.
The law prohibits sterilizing people in prison for the purpose of birth control, but they were doing it anyway.
One of the challenges with this story is you ultimately have to get to intent. And then that's when the doctor said, well, that's cheaper than welfare.
I was looking at these documents that was confirming as a Black woman, my life wasn't shit.
What's going on?
I was very much intimidated by whom I was going up against.
The state has admitted that they have done these illegal surgeries, but we don't actually know who they did them on.
Women's become numbers. You don't get names. And that's what makes it easy to abuse them.
women in California being coercively sterilized is absolutely revolting.
After all this pain, I'll never be the same.
We have yet to get an apology. We have yet to be acknowledged. The state has to be made accountable.
'Cause some wounds never heal. Do you see what you done?
Dana, for that introduction. Just seeing that trailer again, really, there was chills going through my body because the movie is so powerful. I guess my first question, Erica, is how did this story come to you, and why did you decide to create a documentary about it?
Yeah, thank you for that. And thank you for everyone who's here tuning in tonight. Really excited about this conversation. I met attorney Cynthia Chandler in 2010 and was incredibly inspired by her compassionate release work. She was the first attorney in California to get someone out of prison under compassionate release. And she had co-founded this organization called Justice Now, which was one of the only organizations in the country, if not the only organization, that had board members who were currently incarcerated, really informing strategy and informing policy from the inside out, as opposed to the outside in. And they had this campaign called the Let Our Families Have a Future campaign, which essentially exposed the multiple ways that prisons destroy the basic fundamental human right to family. One of the most heinous, of course, being the illegal sterilizations, primarily targeting women of color. And to me, that immediately screamed eugenics. You know, as a Jewish woman, the phrase "never again," you know, was always profoundly in the back of my mind. And when I learned about this different kind of genocide that was happening through imprisonment, through forced sterilization behind bars, I knew that I wanted to get involved some way, somehow. And, you know, initially that was as a volunteer. I became a volunteer legal advocate after Cynthia invited me into the organization. And through that work, I provided direct services for over 150 people inside California's women's prisons. And from there began collaborating with people inside on a project that would ultimately become Belly of the Beast. And in the initial kind of inception, the initial idea was to really chronicle the incredible human rights documentation work that was happening peer-to-peer in prison, and how that information was funneled out through this underground network of activists, because of course the prison didn't want this information getting out. And that changed when I had the opportunity to meet Kelly Dillon, who is our main protagonist in the film, as you see in the trailer. And she was working in Los Angeles at the time when we met as a community interventionist doing domestic violence prevention and gang intervention work. And as a sterilization survivor, you know, she had really moved beyond this at this point in her life, decided to set the sterilization issue aside and really focus on her career. And though deeply, you know, wanted to be involved in some way as someone behind the scenes. So she became a creative collaborator, an advisor behind the scenes, so to speak. And we really talked about the importance of transporting viewers into these worlds that they typically wouldn't have access to. And how do we increase transparency between people who are in prison and free world populations or non-incarcerated populations. And about a year into collaborating with Kelly, the Center for Investigative Reporting released their very controversial findings about the tubal ligations going on inside California's women's prisons by the reporter Corey Johnson. And that, for the first time, created this tremendous momentum. All of a sudden, there was a national conversation, there was potential for litigation, potential for legislation. And that was the moment that Kelly really got called back in. The movement needed her to testify on behalf of so many other people who otherwise wouldn't be able to testify. And that was the moment that we decided that we would begin filming Kelly up to the point when she testified. And the more we filmed together, it became so abundantly clear that the film really needed to center around her narrative and her relationship with attorney Cynthia Chandler. And I think it's important to note that if it hadn't been for Kelly's courage and her tenacity in figuring out what happened to not only her but others, and finding justice for not only her but others, we wouldn't even be here tonight. There wouldn't be a film. There wouldn't be this movement.
Thanks. That's really inspiring. You talked about some of the other people who featured prominently in the film. It's not really just a story about Kelly Dillon. She experienced a really unconscionable and really unforgivable trauma. But it's also the story of Cynthia Chandler, who just really committed herself and her organization to this cause. But there's also the story of Corey Johnson, this reporter who made this decision, to chronicle this in real time. And I feel like the story is a story within a story, and they all come together to give this great, powerful narrative. How did the story change over time? Because you started after you identified that these atrocities had occurred. How did the story change over time as you were creating the story?
Well, initially, the story wasn't really focused on Kelly and Cynthia, and it became more and more clear that it needed to focus on them. And then once the Center for Investigative Reporting happened, it was almost as if the reporting took on a whole nother element of the film, and Corey Johnson became a character. Mm-hmm. And through Corey's reporting, we're able to go back in time, to be able to understand and uncover the things that are really heinous about the legacy of eugenics in this country, as he's discovering it. He is really our conduit to explore so many facets of this issue and how pervasive it really is, and how deeply rooted in white supremacy the legacy of forced sterilization is. And I had no idea that when I began this film, there would even be reporting that was going on simultaneously. And I think that was really a game changer. When I started this film, I had no idea that there would be an unfolding legal drama, that there would be, a series of hearings, there would be legislation. And I think that was kind of something that, you can't predict when you start a film.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, to me, the story of all of these people was just so interesting. And quite honestly, after I saw the film, I started Googling all of this because it's unbelievable. But the more you Google, the more you realize that it's not unbelievable, that in fact, in some instances, these practices were legal. And I think that's definitely a conversation that if you are, consuming media with your kids, having those kinds of conversations really helps you peel away some of the story that's being told, not just the surface level, but what's a little bit below that. The film brings up some really weighty issues beyond really the issue of forced sterilization. You use the term eugenics, and I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that. Because it really, focuses on like control over women's reproductive rights, but it was very specific women in this instance. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that and how it played out in this prison in California.
Yeah, just to provide some context for those who are watching, eugenics is an ideology or a social movement that is based upon improving the human race and society by encouraging reproduction by certain populations with, quote, desirable traits, and discouraging reproduction of certain populations with undesirable traits. So essentially the state gets to decide who the master race will be by controlling who gets to live and who gets to die. Mm-hmm. And when we think about eugenics, typically we think of the Holocaust, Nazi Germany, but many of us don't actually know that the eugenics movement was really, took root here in the United States. California had the most notorious sterilization program, having sterilized over 20,000 people between 1909 and 1979, which was nearly, 1/3 of all the forced sterilizations in the United States. And throughout the 20th century, over 30 states passed eugenics laws, some of which remained on the books until the 1980s. And compulsory sterilization historically targeted those who were people who were poor, women who became pregnant out of wedlock, people with disabilities, people in prison, people of color, and women of color were the most impacted. And we see that, replicate itself in what happened in California's women's prisons as well. Women of color were definitely the most impacted. And when we kind of take a step back and look at who is being imprisoned, in general, women of color are the fastest growing prison population.
Yeah, that was really interesting. In a way, I was kind of annoyed with myself for doing all that Googling, because it brought up a lot of things that I just didn't know. And it kind of, made me angry that these laws were in place for such a long period of time. There's also kind of an underlying thread of systemic racism. Again, that seems to, you were talking about the prison population, you're talking about women of color and how they are disproportionately, the ones who are impacted by these activities. And I'm wondering why why that is something that we should care about, and why should, particularly if we are consuming this media with our kids, why should we talk about it and have critical conversations about what they're seeing and what is actually happening?
Yeah. Well, what I think the big takeaways after watching this film is that eugenics is alive and well. And, in this moment, a lot of people are waking up to the fact that we are witnessing systemic racism and population control through multiple different mechanisms, through policing, through imprisonment, through our immigration detention system. And also who has access to healthcare during the pandemic is another form of this. So really, it's an issue that we all need to be addressing. And we are seeing how pervasive it is in all aspects of society. And, these heinous human rights abuses will continue to occur unless there is accountability. I believe that until we hold our state actors and institutions who continue to commit these harms accountable, they will continue to occur.
Yeah. So one of the things we do at Common Sense is we try to help families have these kinds of discussions based on the film, or the media that they are watching. And I think this particular film that brought up a lot of different subjects, and I'm wondering where you feel a parent could, find that moment to say, so what did you see? What did you think? And how do you believe, if they're talking to, a teen, how do you believe these things are still either happening or did happen? And why do you think they happened? Because I do feel like the idea of forced sterilization sounds like almost like it happened in another period in time, and that it could not be happening now, or it could not be happening in our recent past. How do you think having those kinds of conversations with our kids, how do you start those kind of conversations, particularly using media as kind of the tool, the instigator?
Well, I personally believe that film is one of the most powerful mediums to promote and provoke, very intensive thought and discussion. And I think one of the ways that we really tried to engage viewers through this film is to place viewers in vulnerable, uncomfortable situations. We did that through the visual language of the film so that, audiences may feel for the first time what it would be like to be handcuffed to a gurney, being wheeled into a surgical operating room, what it would be like to be naked on an exam room table, waiting to be examined by a doctor who's employed at the prison where your daily existence is threatened by force, what it would be like to make life-altering decisions about your body in a coercive environment where if you raise questions, you could be retaliated against. And you don't have access to the same information that we in the free world or non-incarcerated populations have access to. It's not like you can Google something on a computer or request, a second opinion, or call your friends and ask, how they dealt with something, or, reach out for additional support. And so, with this film, we really wanted to engage audiences in a way that gave folks access to a world that we typically don't get access to, in hopes of really humanizing and placing audiences in the perspective of those that are so often marginalized and seen as invisible in our society.
So important. One of the things I noticed, and it just jumped out to me so prominently, is in the film, in order to get actual facts about what was happening in prison, a lot of the women in prison would take risk and provide information to people outside of prison about what happened to them, what happened to their friends. And there was a lot of collaboration. There was a lot of, fierce kind of courage that these people in prison had. And it was not something that I expected out of this film, but it was one of those things that in this very weighty film really lifted me up. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. The collaboration is essential to being able to create change. You can't create change that impacts those who are directly impacted without their involvement. And for folks who are incarcerated, it's not like that change can happen without collaboration in the free world as well. Mm-hmm. And so the way that Justice Now was structured, and the way that this really unprecedented way of creating change worked is almost a model for all of us in the world, and that it can't happen if we are working in these silos. And that also to entrust those who are directly impacted to guide the way, to enlighten us. What do they need? How can we train them, for example, in the peer-to-peer human rights documentation? Mm-hmm. Kelly talks about in the film how she was, she carried a briefcase around, helping people figure out how to document what was going on with themselves, mm-hmm. and giving them the courage to file complaints against the prison so that they could potentially be eligible for a personal injury claim or potential litigation further down the road. And we don't hear, as you mentioned, a lot about the collaboration that goes on inside prisons, and prisons are incredibly retaliatory environments, and they are not rehabilitative, they are punitive. Mm-hmm. And so it's important to, while also acknowledging that, show the beauty of the friendship and the collaboration and the change and the activism that is taking place inside these horrific environments.
Yeah, I think that was kind of one of the key takeaways. The role of media as a form of visual journalism, giving you a way to see and feel what these people were feeling, and to have some empathy, and show empathy for these folks. I felt that was I mean, I think that's what media does, at least great media does. And I really do feel like there was something in this film that you felt empathy, but you also felt strength from these folks. You did, there were moments where they felt like victims, but that was not the overall takeaway. I felt like that was really an interesting moment. There was also something that I saw in the trailer and noticed in the film, and there was this, and it was kind of from the perspective of prison staff and administration, and that is, there was this belief that these forced sterilizations were a better approach to dealing with these women because it seemed cost effective. And that was appalling to begin with, but it also seemed to be an excuse that they used when they were asked by legislators, as if it was policy to a certain extent. And I'm wondering where that comes from. You know, this idea that it's cheaper to sterilize than it is to, like you said, rehabilitate or support these women. Where does that come from?
That comes directly from eugenics. The eugenicists always used the cost-effective argument to justify prohibiting certain populations from continuing to be able to have families.
Yeah, it was almost sickening, the idea that it's cheaper to sterilize these women who may or may not have been in prison for things that they actually did. Some of them were falsely accused. And I feel that it just felt so wrong. Can you talk about a little bit, and this to me was probably the nicest part of this film, and that was the music. The song that we heard in the clip, but also that runs through the end of the credits. It is so empowering. It is so uplifting. It is so strong. And you collaborated with a well-known artist. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. The collaboration, as you've spoken about, Diane, throughout the filmmaking process with people who are currently incarcerated was very unique, and major creative decisions were always made in collaboration, even down to the last minute when we were finishing the film and we knew that we wanted to have a major artist be a part of the film as the musical voice of the film. And we asked people inside if there could be one person who could represent your story, through music, who would it be? And everyone hands down said it has to be Mary J. Blige. If we could have anyone to be the musical voice of the film, we would choose Mary J. Blige. So then the question became, well, how do we get Mary J. Blige? And we worked with the incredible music supervisor, Tracy McKnight, on reaching out to her. And, for so many people inside, including Kelly, her music helped them get through some of the most difficult times in prison. And so it was incredibly meaningful to get her involved in the project. And after she watched a rough cut of the film, she said, 100%, I have to be involved. Yes, yes, yes. So at that point, we didn't actually have an ending to the film. We knew that we needed to leave audiences inspired to create change, but also feeling the weight and the legacy of eugenics and how these heinous human rights abuses cannot ever be fixed. As some of the lyrics say, some wounds never heal. Don't you see what you've done? This no amount of money, no amount of reparations can repair these harms. This is a permanent, decision that was made over someone else's body without their consent. And it was very synergistic, serendipitous. The moment that Mary J came on and we had these conversations about how to create this specific vibe and this specific tone, that Cynthia and Kelly were on their way to the California state capitol where they were testifying on behalf of a reparations bill, which would provide survivors with monetary compensation, in addition to a task force to notify survivors who still to this day don't know that they were sterilized, as well as a monument in California that acknowledges California's heinous eugenics history so that it may never continue again. And we cut that scene to the Mary J. Blige song, which was being, produced and at the same time. And honestly, there is no better way to end this film. It was like all the pieces came together. We worked with the dream team, Mary J. Blige and Nova Wave and DJ Camper, on this very powerful, powerful ending.
Yeah, it was amazing and very uplifting. It made me feel good. Making this film almost felt like some form of social activism. It is a way to communicate your beliefs and your feelings through film. Is there anything that you would recommend that folks who are tuning in today can do if this film and what they saw motivates them or inspires them to want to give back in some way? Is there anything you would recommend?
Yes, I really believe if we hold our institutions and state actors who have committed these harms accountable, that we can prevent them from continuing to happen. And I feel like we are literally at the precipice of creating lasting change. We have to confront our eugenics history to prevent a new genocide from occurring. So people can support that in a number of different ways. One, you can go to bellyofthebeastfilm.com and sign our petition demanding reparations for sterilization survivors. And I believe that this will not only support the survivors in California, but set a precedent for other states across the country, so we don't continue to see these incidents like what we just saw in the Georgia Immigration Detention Center a couple of months ago, the mass hysterectomies coming out of the ICE facility in Irwin County. Right. And also, I would encourage people to find an organization that they can align with in their own city, to take one small action in challenging white supremacy, or to join an organization that does direct service work with people inside women's prisons and reach out via a letter writing campaign. A lot of organizations are working to increase that transparency between free world and non-incarcerated or incarcerated populations. And so that's a great way to help support, is by being that kind of conduit through a letter writing campaign. And we have a list of those partner organizations on our website, bellyofthebeastfilm.com.
Great. I just want to let everyone know that if you have questions, please put them in the live chat. Erica is available to answer those questions. But I have one other question, and this is really about the language that you use. When we were preparing for this, you talked and used language. You didn't call the women prisoners. You didn't call them, you called them women in prison. And I'd love to understand how language in particular, because this is something that when we are talking to our kids and helping them frame how things are happening in their lives, how are you using language to help people kind of change the perspective and humanize the idea?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a very pertinent line in the film where one of the nurses who worked in a women's prison says, inmates become numbers, and that's what makes it so easy to abuse them. After taking the Hippocratic Oath, after being someone as a healthcare professional who cares deeply for the well-being of people, inmates become numbers, and that's what makes it so easy to abuse them. So when we use these terms like inmate, like criminal, like prisoner, that is dehumanizing and puts a label on someone that ignores that they are a human being, a person first. So we always like to say people in prison, women in prison, someone who's imprisoned. And, I also think it's important to note that not everyone who is in a woman's prison identifies as a woman. So we typically like to say, when we're speaking in general terms, people in women's prisons.
Got it. Yeah, that makes sense. I think those are teachable moments, not just for kids, but for adults as well.
Absolutely.
The question, a question has come in, and I think it's a really interesting one. Question is, what these doctors and the state have done to these 1,400 plus women falls under the legal definition of rape, not just medical malpractice. Do you think they will face rape charges in our lifetimes?
No, unfortunately. I don't think that the doctors or the state will have any ramifications as a result of things right now. I think that the way that we hold the state accountable in this moment, because there have already been investigations by the medical board into the practices of these doctors. There have been investigations, there have internal investigations into the practices of the federal receivership and the state and the Department of Corrections. And of course, this is a massive cover-up. It's one institution blaming another institution, blaming another institution, covering up this massive 1,400 sterilizations. So a way that we can ensure accountability is by, and demanding that the state compensate the survivors. That's the way that our society, deals with harm. That's the way that our society reckons with wrongdoing.
Which is kind of a shame. Here's a great question. Have you seen any evidence of eugenics in men's prisons?
Well, I'm going to take a step back and talk about prisons as another form of eugenics in themselves. If you lock up certain populations, that is another way to sterilize them. If you lock up people throughout their reproductive capacity years, that is another form of sterilization. And most recently in the news, the Kenosha sheriff last fall described men's prisons as a way to keep, quote, Black men from having children. I mean, if there's not a more explicit example of eugenics, I don't know what is.
Wow, that is, it's believable, but it's reprehensible. I have another question, and it is really about the title of the film. I think we all have some idea of what it means, but why did you use it as the title of your film?
Yeah, it's such a great question. The film's title initially came from an interview with this incredible activist, Kanoa, who identifies as a Hawaiian African-American transgender man inside Central California's women's facility, which is the largest women's prison in the world. And he was really an early champion and advisor to the film, in addition to being a survivor of forced sterilizations. And when he spoke about the sterilizations and the horrific abuses inside California's women's prisons, he said, "We are inside the belly of the beast." When they say that the California Department of Corrections is the belly of the beast, it is literal. And I was profoundly struck by the pain and the poetry and the power in his words. And I asked other survivors, how they felt about this potential title. And it provoked so much discussion about systemic racism as the beast and whose wombs are valued in our society. And we all knew it was the right fit.
Right. Yeah, it's a great title. Quick question about, and this is more about your process, but the filming in prison. I mean, the scenes that I identified as actually being filmed in prison almost felt like you were in an imprisoned place and not really able to have freedom of movement within the prison. Can you talk a little bit about what it was like filming in prison?
Thank you for that question, Diane. For so many people, prisons are so far out of sight, out of our consciousness, far from our physical reach. They're placed in locations that are inaccessible via public transportation. They're far from major cities. And we are rarely granted access to worlds behind walls that aren't dramatized or sensationalized. And so I wanted to reimagine how we visualize imprisonment using imagery that really contrasts confinement and freedom, and imagery that evokes passage of time and memory, and to really place viewers within these vulnerable, uncomfortable spaces. And our filmmaking team didn't have access to some of these spaces. So we chose to carefully reconstruct, agonizing over every little detail, feeling the weight of responsibility through this project and the gravity of accurately depicting each memory, each moment, each restricted space, which were so carefully described to me by people in prison. And I think challenges surrounding access actually provided really that creative opportunity to visually demystify incarceration and really push the boundaries of what we are typically used to seeing surrounding imprisonment. So the film actually opens with these wide aerials, these wide drone shots of the California Central Valley, as Kelly takes us in, guides us through this visceral and gut-wrenching introduction to imprisonment. And as our focus narrows, we find ourselves literally from these wide aerials into the belly of the beast, into prison, and finally into an interior cell as the title comes up.
Yeah, it definitely felt like that. Looks like we've got another question from Alexander. From the research that you collected on forced sterilization without prisoners' knowledge, how long has this been happening in U.S. jails, and how many women have been affected? And were they all racialized women?
It's a really good question. And I think the important thing to note in answering this is we don't know. There is no transparency about this. And we don't know the demographics of the 1,400 sterilizations that were performed. We don't know who, what, how. And, the only data that we have is on about 152 ligations that were performed between 2006 and 2010. In reaching out to other states across the country, we know from Freedom of Information Act requests that at least 8 states allow for sterilizations for the purpose of birth control under certain circumstances, but we don't know to what degree. And in speaking with other organizations across the country that do direct service work inside women's prisons, they have also confirmed that this is happening. But because of the levels of secrecy and privacy that these institutions hide behind, it's impossible to know how pervasive it really is.
Got it. So one more question. Can you share with us your process of choosing projects, and can you talk about your next project?
It's a great question. Diane, you mentioned earlier that this is, a form of activism. And, the projects that I choose to tell are absolutely a form of activism. And they are stories that are character-driven narratives about some sort of larger social issue. And when I find out about something, I've been so fortunate to have these serendipitous moments, in meeting Cynthia Chandler and becoming a volunteer legal advocate, or my previous film, running into Judge Khulud, the first woman judge in the Middle East religious courts at a meeting. These instances are just, they happen for me, and it's a story that just literally I can't get out of my head, and I know that I am compelled to tell, that I will do anything and everything it takes to tell this story. In the case of Belly of the Beast, it took 10 years. One of the most challenging things about Belly of the Beast for me personally, in addition to it being very traumatic subject matter and a difficult film to get made, was that I couldn't talk publicly about this film until last June. We were completely under the radar to preserve the campaign to end sterilization abuse, as well as to protect participants' legal cases and prevent the potential for retaliation. And I find myself in a similar situation now where I can't talk about future projects. So please stay tuned for more information on that.
That's great. So I think we are going to have to end this. And I can personally say this was the best thing I've done all week. Watching the film was horrifying, but I had to watch it twice because I felt like the information was so important. And these people just really motivated and hit me in an emotional way. So I want to thank you for that. I think I'm turning it over to Dana now. Is there anything? Actually, I did have one more thing. If people walk away from today's conversation, what are a couple things you think they should think about or that they should take away from this conversation? Because this world is probably so new to almost everyone. What are the things that they should take away?
That eugenics is alive and well, that it's not something of the past, that we are confronting this on a daily basis today, and we need to continue to confront. We, have the potential. I think Cynthia and Kelly and the entire, team of amazing participants in this film show us that we have the power to create change. And if they could fight this David and Goliath battle,
right,
against the Department of Corrections, against the federal government, we can do the same. And we can join the movement in challenging modern day eugenics and reproductive injustice and systemic racism. So we do have the power to do so. And I hope this film just is one illuminating point, a part of the larger conversation that is highlighting these injustices.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much, Erica. I cannot thank you enough. This was a great moment in time to share with the Common Sense audience. Dana, I am going to turn it back over to you. And again, thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Sorry about that. I was muted. I just wanted to thank you both for sharing the story, Diane, for the great questions to get our audience kind of understanding of everything that Erica has done and built. And if this doesn't inspire young people to go out there and be journalists and reporters and find the truth, I can't imagine what else would. So I certainly hope that parents and schools, educators are out there in the audience, to think about sharing this with your school. Obviously, this is a film that you should read our review, and it is for 13 and over. It's it's for mature audiences, but this is so powerful and it has so many stories woven into it. So Erica, thank you for joining us tonight, to allowing us to take this journey with you. And there is no doubt after tonight, if you had any doubt, that the power of media can help us build empathy and create social change. We will be sending all of the audience a link to view the film in its entirety and information on how your school or community can watch Belly of the Beast in its full form. As a reminder, I do want to say that Common Sense recommends this film, do not forget, for teens 13 and up. And we're committed to sharing great media and helping you make informed choices about what works for your kids. And as a nonprofit, we rely on our community to help support our work. So if you were inspired by tonight's discussion, we hope you'll consider supporting Common Sense. But most importantly, thank you all for joining us tonight. And thank you, Erica and Diane, for taking us on this journey. It was inspiring. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dana.